All right, Mr. Ambassador, really want to thank you for taking the time to sit down with us here. This is a really important room here. We see world leaders come through here quite a bit. President Trump spoke here just a few weeks ago. He talked a lot about how we need to reform the United Nations and make it, and question kind of the purpose of the United Nations. President Trump has really carved out in his second term here in the White House that he is the peace president, if you will. First off, talk to us about President Trump's role as the peace president and how we make the United Nations help him achieve those goals.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, thanks for having me here in the General Assembly, in the United Nations. And people ask me all the time, what's my agenda as ambassador here? And my answer is easy. It's President Trump's peace agenda. Right? He is the president of peace. He has used the power of the presidency, the power of his personality, and the fact that all of these world leaders and the relationships he's developed may not trust each other. In fact, oftentimes hate each other, but they trust him. And so as he said right here in the General Assembly, when his teleprompter didn't work, but I told him, I said, Mr. President, I think it was a great thing because in many ways it just shows you unscripted. Any other world leader would have melted right there, not him, because his convictions are so clear, his agendas are so clear, and he just kind of charged forward. What he really asked in that speech, and what I asked even in my testimony before the Senate, is what is the purpose of the UN? And how do we get it back to basics? It was founded in the wake of World War II. It was really put together by those who won the Second World War into one, how do we prevent a third World War? And then how do we bring peace and prosperity around the world and ensure that stays in place? So like we've seen in our own federal government, we've got to cut out all the nonsense, all the climate and gender and woke agenda. And just as we've had to do that in Washington, we've got to do it right here in New York and get it back to basics, stopping wars, preventing wars, and keeping the peace. And that's what the president's all about, and that's what I'll be all about here as the ambassador.
So, Mr. Ambassador, I think the president said that the potential for the United Nations, during his address here, he talked about it as incredible. I think the word he used was tremendous, right? The potential is tremendous. Yeah. How do we get to that point, though, where that potential is realized?
So look, I mean, I know there's a lot of people out there, rightly so. I was a former member of Congress. If I went to a town hall in North Florida and talked to a bunch of mechanics, teachers, firefighters, is there money, and we pay for, by the way, a quarter of everything the UN does, the United States pays for. Is there money being well spent? I'd say right now, no, because it's being spent on all of these other woke projects rather than what it was originally intended to do, what President Trump wants it to do, and what I want it to do, which is focus on peace. And I would say to those who say, why don't we just shut this thing down and walk away? Well, I think we need it to be reformed in line with its potential that President Trump sees. And I think my answer would be, we need one place in the world where everybody can talk. President Trump is a president of peace. He wants to keep us out of war. He wants to put diplomacy first. He wants to create deals. Well, there's one place in the world, and that's right here at the UN, that the Chinese, the Russians, the Europeans, developing countries all over the world can come and do their best to hash things out. And I think if we, frankly, give the UN some tough love, which we're doing right now, and get them away from all of that other nonsense, whether it's a climate agenda or the gender ideology or what have you, and get it focused back on creating peace deals and helping the president do what he does best, then we can help it realize its potential. And we have an entire strategy and plan to do that.
Yeah, so I want to get into all of that, and I know the Secretary General has put forward a proposal as well, and I want to talk about that, but let's talk about some of the more broader problems first, right? Like, so what we've seen, I know you've mentioned climate a couple times now. I watched an interview, you talked about this. You said that they have 7 different agencies for climate, right? Like, I think they have a bunch of different other agencies. I mean, even on things like economic aid or things like that, they have like 5 or 6 different ones, I watched Ambassador Bartels testifying about this to the Senate. We've seen, you mentioned ESG, the ESG stuff. They're also focused on gender stuff, all sorts of things like that. Where are they wasting all this money on?
So just like we saw with USAID, this progressive ideology has infected so many aid organizations. And then here at the UN, which has been around, again, since the end of World War II, set up in the wake of it in the 1940s, it's now proliferated and bloated and grown like so many other bureaucracies would and do over 80 years. There's 7 agencies that say their number one objective is dealing with climate. Like
7.
Regardless of how you feel about it and what you want to debate on it, let's get that down to 1, right, at best, and cut out the other 6. They're what they call the Secretariat, which is kind of like the executive branch, has grown to tens of thousands of employees living here in one of the most expensive cities in the world. We're going to cut that back. Look, we are withholding American funding. The president is withholding American funding until we see the reforms. We haven't done that since Jesse Helms did it in 1999. It's been 25 years. President Trump has done it, and in just the month that I've been here, we have a 15% cut to the overall UN budget. We have an 18% cut to their overall personnel. We have a 25% cut to their global peacekeeping force. We have the Secretary General has put forth a reform plan called the UN 80. It's the 80th anniversary of the UN, where he's going to consolidate a bunch of these out of control agencies. He's going to cut the overhead and the bureaucracy. We are going to give the UN tough love. I think we're going to save it from itself in many ways, and we're going to drive change. And the president knows best on how to use that leverage. And my job is to actually push the UN to execute.
Yeah, so on that note, the Secretary General has put forward this plan to cut 15% of their budget. I mean, that's remarkable to see a bureaucrat offer a plan to cut 15% of his own budget.
Remember, not to interrupt you, remember in Washington, when the Democrats, for example, promote budget cuts, it's just a decrease in the increase, right? It's not an actual cut. So I could already hear the voices, well, 15%, that's not enough. It's not, we agree. But those are actual cuts, and it's the first time in the UN's history that a Secretary General has actually proposed, at our urging, to make this place smaller. And so I would just say it's just the beginning.
Right, so we saw this after the president addressed this room, and he spoke right up here at this podium, where, we saw the teleprompter issues, obviously,
Yep.
but later that day, the president sat down with the Secretary General,
Yep.
And the Secretary General seemed to express that he wants the UN to work with President Trump on this peace agenda,
Yep.
and again, also seems very open to the reforms that we're talking about here, because he's put forward this plan. Talk to us about your relationship with the Secretary General and his willingness to go along with the plans that you guys are proposing.
Well, look, I have no problem. I'm a soldier by background, and and I fought for conservative causes as a congressman from North Florida. I have no problem sitting down and saying, let's do, as Reagan said, let's do less better, right? And often getting bureaucrats and staff out of the way will actually help this organization be more effective. And like we're seeing in Washington, we've actually got, Matt, the mid-level coming to us quietly saying, thank you. Because of your tough love, so to speak, because of your strong push, many of them have been trying to push these reforms internally for years and getting nowhere. And now, just in the last couple of months, they're seeing results. So that's one piece. The other piece I want to be sure to hit here, and kind of the why do we even participate in this whole thing, is there are many of these agencies that govern, regulate, provide standards for things around the world that deeply affect our economy and our businesses. These are in telecommunications, space, international shipping, spectrum allocation, right? All kinds of things that have to do with workers and workers' rights. So when you hear about trying to bring manufacturing back home here, if you've got countries around the world that basically, do slave labor. All the offshoring that's happened over the years as we try to drive those supply chains back home that really matter. So we have to make a choice. Do we just walk away and let China and Russia and all of these other countries set those global standards? Or do we get in there and block and tackle in line for our companies and in line for an America First agenda? We just had a huge success story with the International Maritime Organization. Nobody's ever heard of it. It's based out of London. That sets global standards for how our ports operate around the world, how shipping operates, what kind of fuel they use. They were this close to mandating that we basically have a Green New Deal in our global shipping fleet. 80% of our economy is based on trade. It would have been devastating. In fact, it would have added $1 billion a month to the cost of sending our goods around the world or receiving goods. And we got fired up as a cabinet. The EU, Brazil, and others thought this thing was a done deal. We got everybody involved, including the president. He came in off the top ropes, and we defeated that vote. And I think we just saved the American consumer a massive, what would have been the first UN tax in global history just this past week. So that's the kind of fighting that we're doing in the types of these organizations and the kind of wins that we have to deliver for the American people.
So it sounds like in a case like this is why you don't just walk away from
that. Would be,
UN
look, if we just
entirely.
walked away, they would have done it. We would have ignored it. But you know what? As whether it's our farmers exporting our crops or our manufacturers bringing in certain parts they need or what have you, everybody would have been affected. So I'm squarely in the camp of let's fight. Let's fight for the American consumer and the American people and American industry. And to the extent our economy is touching the world, we have to be engaged in these organizations.
So on the global maritime thing that we were
Yep.
talking about there in London, I was going to ask about that in a little bit, but the what we saw is that they were very, very close to doing this, and then
It was, from their perspective, a done deal.
Right. So
Yeah.
then Secretary Rubio and President Trump, yourself, all start sounding the alarm, and then you guys totally turn the tide against it.
It was also Secretary Duffy, Transportation, Secretary Wright, Energy, right? It was, of course, Secretary Rubio. It was really an across the board, a number of senators that were raising the alarm bells as well, especially with big ports and where shipping and trade really matter to their states and districts. So it was one of those things that was kind of bubbling along, and we're ringing the alarm bells, and then we just grabbed a hold of it, and the president brought what only he can do with a powerful truth. And this is what they're not used to with Biden and the previous administration. We said there will be consequences if you do this, and we laid out what those consequences were. Now, we were accused of being diplomatic gangsters and bullies and what have you, but look, you're just, in fact, it was they who were being the climate bullies, and we're not going to allow them to do that to our shipping fleet. And if it had happened, here was the real secret. The EU was subsidizing all the fuels, the biofuels that they wanted to push our ships to, and the only place we could retrofit our ships were in Chinese ports and shipyards. So this would have been a win for the EU, a win for China, a loss for the United States, and we said we're not going to have it, and we got in there and won.
So can you explain what would have been implemented had they done this? And then also,
Yep.
Are we on guard? Are they going to try this again through this organization or through another one? And how do we protect this
So
from
essentially
happening?
what would have been implemented is if we had fossil fuel burning ships by a certain date, 5-10 years from now, starting next year, if we had, coal-fired, gas-fired, oil-fired ships, this global organization was going to impose a fine on those shipping companies, of course, and that would have been to the tune of $1 billion a month globally. That would have been passed on to the consumers, obviously, and that money then would have formed a UN-run green climate slush fund to the tune of 12 to 15 billion a year that would have turned around and done more and more of this. It really would have been the first global green tax. And I think we would have felt it through inflation. We would have felt it on our consumer shelves. and it would have been yet another assault on the American oil and gas industry.
Right, and so are they trying again?
Of course they're going to try again.
Yeah.
So because we came at this, frankly, a little bit last minute, we won, but we delayed the vote until next year. We're going to make our position crystal clear. And I don't think this thing's going to get through. Now, this is just the tip of the iceberg. It's what's happening in these over 80 organizations around the world. And what it really amounts to is a climate ideology that is nonsensical. It's an ideology that just doesn't make sense. For example, in AI, a big piece of that is power. You can't power AI through wind and solar. You just can't. And we already know the president's problems with wind. We already know that the vast majority of solar panels are made where? In China. But we need an all-of-the-above solution. We need nuclear, we need gas, we need oil, we need coal, and those other renewable forms and forms of energy in order to win. But what we find is even when we reach, say, some kind of trade deal with a country or with the EU, then they try to backdoor these regulations in favor of them and against us through these international organizations that are often under the UN umbrella. And that's why we need fighters in here. I have Tammy Bruce that will be going to the Senate to be the deputy ambassador here. We have myself and we have other members of the team that 100% believe in the president's America First agenda, and we're going to start fighting and blocking and tackling in these organizations.
So you talked about the standards, the international standards that are being set through these different things.
Right.
Like, I think something that comes to mind is like, the shape of plugs or something, right? That but the point is that like this is every part of your life could be affected by these standards. Can you explain this for people? And like, people back home watching this, like how important is it that the United States win against our adversaries around the world when these are being set?
90% of global financial data, right, that run our markets, that run the stock exchanges, our commodities trading, go through undersea cables. 90%, not through satellites, not through radio or what have you. They go through these undersea fiber optic cables. Those fiber optic cables go through international waters. So who decides where they go, how big they are, when they're laid, which companies? These international bodies come to a consensus, right? And so if we're not there, China, Russia, the Europeans, and others will be there setting these standards that will then affect us. Critical minerals is a key thing now that is driving our modern economy. Well, we have an initiative, it was an executive order the president signed on seabed mining. Again, in international waters, there's these nodules of like manganese and cobalt and what have you. Who governs that? Who puts environmental regulations and what have you? So really it's anything that leaves our airspace and leaves our international waters, then it comes to these international bodies to decide the rules of the road. Aviation, key point there. I don't know about you, Matt, but I want pilots, air traffic controllers, and what have you around the world speaking English, having the same standards of how you take off and you land, right? Having air traffic controllers trained to a certain standard, having mechanics, if you land in Paris or Abu Dhabi or somewhere, trained to a certain standard that are fixing the planes. All of those are set. There's an International Civil Aviation Organization in Montreal. Those are all set by these international bodies, and they all affect whether it's our airlines or mining companies or shipping companies. And so we have to be in there. We have to win.
Okay, so outside of these standard setting things, what are other ways that maybe our adversaries are standing in the way of achieving the reforms that we're talking about here?
So interestingly, and this is where, as part of what we do, we seek to find kind of common ground. China is increasingly paying more and more into the UN system so that they can have more and more influence. But at the same time, as more of their money is on the line, they're looking at the bureaucracy here and actually working with us to cut back on it some. So there's places where we can kind of work together, whether it's them or others, to make this place more efficient. And then we'll lobby and we'll use what levers we have to win these votes. But if you look at, for example, AI governance, we're fighting for AI freedom. If you want to keep the federal government out of the way, we definitely want to keep a globalist government out of the way. But we're seeing China influence these bodies so that it benefits their technology and their producers and not ours. And that's where we have to fight this fight.
You started here during the week of the UN General Assembly, so big week to start, right?
Which is kind of like the Super Bowl of global diplomacy. Literally almost every single world leader, their foreign ministers, their finance ministers, their whole delegations come to these couple of city blocks all at once, including the president, the secretary, and half our cabinet. And I had the distinction of getting voted out of the Senate the day before.
Day before.
Yeah.
So so I was up here. I talked to a couple world leaders while we were here. I talked to the Prime Minister of Qatar. I talked to the President of the Republic of Congo. Over the course of the year, I've talked to a lot of other world leaders: the Prime Minister of Greece, the President of Cyprus, the Prime Minister of Israel, obviously the President of the United States. One of the things I've seen from talking to world leaders around the world is here in Trump's second term, especially, even more so than his first, people really seem to be rallying to his vision of peace around the world, right? What are your thoughts on how he was received here during that week of UNGA, and more broadly, just in his second term here, how the rest of the world is? It does seem like they're catching up to him this time.
Oh my God, it's interesting to see what a lot of these governments may say publicly. But then behind the scenes and closed doors, especially when it comes to reforming this place, they look at me and go, "Thank you," right? And please tell President Trump, my president, my foreign minister thanks him and would love to be able to come to the Oval Office soon. So you look at these conflicts that have just been frozen around the world, whether it was DRC and Congo, Armenia and Azerbaijan. We could go down the list. Thailand and Cambodia, of course, the Middle East. And in just 8 months, he has suspended, stopped, or completely solved 8 of them in 8 months, right? His question to this body is, where have you been? And help me more. And when we sat down with the Secretary General was very gracious and said, we want to help you more. We deeply appreciate you, President Trump, putting the credibility and the power of the presidency of the United States on the line to actually fix these problems. But interestingly, and this gets to another piece of what the UN does a lot, is kind of aid, right? He said, we want to use the UN's presence around the world to lower barriers for American companies to come in, because he agrees with where the president is, I am, and his cabinet, that when American companies invest, not only does it create jobs back home, but rising tide lifts all boats. Rather than just throwing money and aid dollars at a problem, let's actually improve the lives of the people there. And when people, for example, in the Middle East through the Abraham Accords, are talking about rail and ports and data centers, they're not talking about who has been shooting who for the last 2,000 years. And so watching the Secretary General and this body buy into the president's kind of business first, business binds people together approach, and an economics first approach, has been really fascinating.
Right, so that kind of brings us back to the Secretary General's plan and what we've seen. So the first phase of this, it has to be adopted here by the Budget Committee, which has all 193 countries. All 193 member states get to vote on this, and I think it happens via consensus.
Right.
How does the U.S. achieve getting a consensus worldwide here? And this all has to happen by the end of the year, right?
Yeah.
Because
so it's kind of like, how the president proposes a budget and then Congress, has to come into it.
But in Congress, you could have a few votes against it.
You can have a few votes.
Like,
this is basically, it's got to be
consensus.
unanimous. So first steps first was getting the Secretary General to say, we got to have cuts, and to propose those cuts over to this body. The reality is, between us and China, we pay about half of the budget. And if President Trump and his team, for the first time since the late 90s, is saying, we're done throwing good dollars after bad. This is the American people's money. Until we see these reforms, we're going to take that message to, look, a lot of these, almost all of these countries receive our money one way or another. The United States pays into the UN system more than 183 countries combined. So if they want to continue to see our support and our help and with the backing of the American people, they got to clean up their act, and that's the message we're going to send loud and clear, and I think we'll get them there.
Right, and so beyond the budget stuff, then from what I understand, there's other reforms that can maybe happen next year, right?
Yep.
Like, so you got to get this stuff. This is year one stuff.
Year one stuff, we got to get the budget, but also we got to cut back on the bloated bureaucracy.
Sure.
And those things we can get done in the next year. And we already got done just in month one a 25% cut to peacekeeping, basically these UN peacekeepers that are around the world. Some of these peacekeeping missions have been sitting around for 30, 40, 50 years. They're not doing what they intended to do. The Secretary General has agreed. We had a number of conversations to a 25% cut around the world. That's already starting to roll.
Right. So, but the ultimate goal here really does seem to be to almost bend the will of the United Nations to the American interest, to see how do we use this body to achieve that American interest of achieving peace around the world and stability.
Yeah, and it was the UN founding interest, right? It's just getting it, like so many agencies, bureaucracies, it's just drifted in terms of what it's doing. And this is really pushing it, kicking and screaming back to that original vision, post-World War II. Let's never have another world war, and let's drive an agenda that creates a forum for countries to solve their conflicts peacefully. And that's what we're going to push them to do.
It really feels like America is back in the driver's seat now with President Trump in the White House and you guys here. And just tell us about like your interactions with other your counterparts around the world. It does seem like they're excited to engage in these reforms that we're talking about.
Oh, they are. Whether it's my first kind of bigger sit down was, for example, with the Caribbean countries. Right in our Western Hemisphere, we've got the gangs and the cartels and many of these trafficking organizations that have been running the show for far too long with no consequences. So they're going and crashing people, weapons, drugs onto our shores, and it destabilizes all of these smaller island countries. And we sat down and they said, thank you. How can we now work together through this body? One, the first and foremost is we just created through the UN a gang suppression force in Haiti. We've given them an offensive mandate. And a key part of the America First agenda is what? The United States shouldn't have to do all of this alone. We need burden sharing. So the Kenyans are helping, El Salvador is helping, Guatemala is helping. But the United States has to lead and convene. And so that's an example of what we just did in the last couple of weeks that directly affects the migration crisis we've seen under the last 4 years, the drug crisis, the fentanyl crisis we've seen in the last at least 4 years, right? And in line with the president's agenda that we've ignored the Western Hemisphere for far too long. And we're going to get it back under control. And
Mr. Ambassador, last thing I'd ask you here is that it does seem like if you go back to Trump's first term, he one of the biggest accomplishments he did around the world was he re-energized NATO. Yeah. It seems like in his second term here, he could fix this place, right? Like this place could be, the place that it was meant to be, right? Like, and that it kind of drifted away from.
We've had the NATO Secretary General repeatedly say, only President Trump could get both Zelensky and Putin on the phone. Only President Trump could get them from not talking at all to at least we've gone from here to here. We're not quite there yet. And the rest of the world has to help out, and that means you have these burden-sharing mechanisms, whether it's NATO, whether it's ASEAN and APEC, the president's trip out to Asia, or whether it's right here to the UN. If anybody can clean this place up, and I'd be proud to be a small part of it, it's President Trump. And I think you're absolutely right. That's going to be a key element of his second term.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
All right, man. Yeah, for sure.
Yep.